So, yeah, ready when you are, Emer, yeah.
Hi, so I think I know most people here. I'm Emer Gilmartin from Team C, and this is kind of a practice run for a paper we have accepted in speech prosody, which is to be a video conference. But I'm aware that this is not a linguistics group, so I'm going to try and situate it within the work we do in Team C as well. Okay, so. Let's go. So the problem is nowadays social talk has become huge. This idea of dialogue systems, artificial dialogue systems that can do more than just sell you a pizza or tell you your bank balance. And there's always been this dream of having systems that can somehow build a relationship, for example, a caring relationship or a tutoring relationship, or more so even a friendly relationship at this stage. So there are many problems in trying to build this, and not least of which is a lot of the early work in this area came from linguistics. And linguistics had a tendency, because it wasn't always audiovisual, to be based on writing and to think of the written text as being the canonical form of language, and that spoken language was somehow maybe debased or a little chaotic. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is that when people started building natural language interfaces, and in particular spoken language interfaces or spoken dialogue systems, they very quickly came across the problem that if you think of a task or an interaction where there's a very clear short-term goal, like the classic is buying a pizza, it's quite easy to map that dialogue out and to model it. But if you think of what goes on when you have a chat with your friends or people talking together over dinner, it's very, very difficult to think about how to model that. So James Allen in 2000 came up with this practical dialogue hypothesis, which was basically, we're going to concentrate on the tasks, on the low-hanging fruit. We leave the being friend stuff for later. So these are two problems. And because they concentrated on the task-based dialogues for such a long time, the problem of social dialogue wasn't as obvious, because the task-based systems were working quite well. But recently, with the explosion of interest in things like Siri and Alexa and speech technology in general, there is a return to the idea of making more social talk available on dialogue systems. So why do we want this? Well, the usual idea is that, well, speech is the most natural form of, you get these side ideas like hands-free systems, etc. But the idea of social talk is, well, people generally do most of their business in a sort of a matrix of social and friendly conversation. And therefore, we are built to understand that kind of information delivery and also that kind of relationship building. And so to meet the human affordances, we should try and make the dialogue systems able to talk in this way. So the next problem, which is a slightly more practical problem for us, is that these systems are generally based on corpora of conversations, so we know what to model. Unfortunately, most of the corpora built over the last 20, 30 years, and that really means most corpora, are based on task-based or information gap activities. So there's a lot of questioning and answering. It's a nice, standard, easy to look at dialogue. So for example, you have things like map tasks or diapics. Anyway, they're not really what we need. So very quickly, the differences between ordering a pizza. When you order a pizza, it's very important that the pizza seller gets the flavor you want, the size you want, the price, and you make the deal. But imagine if you were talking to your neighbor, well, not now, but before, and hopefully soon again. If you were just having a chat with the neighbor, you could be talking about the football. You may have no interest whatsoever in who won the match last night. But you go along with it because in some sense you're building a bond that pragmatically may be useful for you at some time, for example, if you needed some home repairs or something. But this is what we do. And in social talk, the how is very important. The how is tone of voice, pausing, how fast we speak, how slowly we speak. We're all completely familiar with the idea of an awkward silence, which we'll avoid at all costs. So it can also carry on for quite some time. And these conversations that can be broken into and out of, for example, in an office or in a healthcare situation, often wrap around very important transactions, such as checking medication, buying or selling. But the social talk keeps that channel open, or it can be a goal in itself, in that it's an entertainment system or a system that's doing some sort of edutainment. So we're interested in the structure of these conversations. Now, so let's jump right in and look at a conversation. What you're seeing there is, if you were to take what we normally get, which are start times and end points for people speaking and laughing and everything, and visualize it, you're looking at rows of 3 rows per frame, and there are 20-second frames in this. Each row is one speaker. So you have speaker A, B, C. And the gray is background, it's silence. The green is speech. The yellow is laughter, and the pink is what's called a speech laugh. And there are other bits and pieces like lip smacks and yawns and coughs in this one. So we're going to look only at the speech and silence in order to learn more about the structure of the talk. We don't care what they're saying. We just care when they're speaking and when they're not speaking. So we scrub out everything on that isn't green or gray, that isn't either speech or silence. So we come to something like this. So this is the basis of our analysis: speech, silence. Now, what we're really interested in is what happens when one person speaks and then they stop and another person speaks. So for example, if you look at the row starting at 810 there, you'll see that A seems to be dominating. But then around 840, A is speaking, B is speaking, C is speaking, A and B and C are speaking, and then B seems to carry on. So what we're looking at there is some form of turn change. Now, if you think about a classic system, the expectation would be that A speaks, stops, B speaks, stops, C speaks. Quite obviously, that's not what's happening in real life. And whatever you do, if you get a system that sounds like a human and acts like a human in some sense, people are going to expect to be able to interrupt, to have overlapping, etc. So that's what we're looking at. Okay, so this is just a close-up of one of these exchanges where A is coming in and B is coming out. C is coming out, and there's a little bit of argy-bargy with A, B, and C in the middle to get from one side to the other. That's what we're looking at. We're calling these transitions. Okay? So what we want is to better understand how these transitions happen. So this has been done in the past in 2 main ways: in conversation analysis and stochastic analysis. Conversation analysis being people either remembering or recording pieces of conversation and saying, this is what happens. There are no numbers, there are no percentages, there are no likelihoods of this particular thing being more likely than another. It's simply, this is what we say happens in conversation. And then we do this very, very minute study of the timings, what exactly happens, the pauses, the gaps. The other is at the other extreme is a pure statistical stochastic analysis. And people have been doing this for a long time, looking at speech and silence patterns and trying to find what they tell you about the analysis. It's been done a lot in psychological studies where you can tell personality traits from how people behave in a conversation, basically. You can also sometimes identify speakers. You can also, on a grander scale, identify whether what you're looking at is a meeting or a casual conversation or some form of ritual. So we're going on a sort of a middle path because we'd like to know what exactly is happening around the transitions, not on the very general scheme. but we want to know how often it's happening as well, so that we can form a catalogue of what actually happens when when turns change or are retained, which will then help us to know what we should be putting into systems. Okay, so there has been previous work similar to our own in dyadic talk, and we're using a scheme defined by people from Martin's University. I forgot to introduce my co-authors, I'll do it at the end. So they've defined overlap and silence. So if speaker A starts and then speaker B butts in, but speaker A continues, and then speaker A continues, they would define that as a within speaker overlap. So one speaker, two speakers, one speaker, but the second speaker is the original speaker. A within speaker silence would be when A starts speaking, when A is speaking, there's a silence and A continues. So for example, A stops to breathe, or A stops and starts again. Then you have the between speaker silence and overlap, which are the same idea, except A goes in, B interrupts, and B continues. So the turn changes. A goes in, there's a silence, and B continues. So there's a between speaker silence. So now, I'm going to race through this because I started late. Right, so what we're looking at now is, we're looking at almost a new way of seeing this. So we had to come up with quite a bit of terminology, I'm sorry. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that there are three speakers, A, B, and C. It's fictitious. Well, there's some speech people in the room. The proportions of speech and silence on this are way out. They're not real. So speaker A speaks, stops for a while, speaks again, stops, speaks again. These are the individual tracks. Same for B, same for C. Now, first of all, we would call those stretches of speech with silence on either side for each person. So this one, and this one are called IPU, or interpausal units. They're pretty much a theory neutral way of saying this person speaks for X amount of time. We're not saying whether they have the turn or don't have the turn or anything. Then you'll see that you can have overlap. So for example, if we look at the first 1 second, A is speaking alone. Whoops. A is speaking alone. So that's one party speech. If we look at the second interval, A and C are speaking. So there's overlap, two party overlap there. C, one speaker. BC is B and C are speaking. And then in this little piece here, A, B, and C are speaking. So we have three party overlap. Back to two party. Then B speaks, so B is single party speech. BC, two party overlap, C, single party, and so on and so forth. GX in all of this means a general silence or a global silence when everybody is quiet. So the basis of this analysis is we create these floor state labels, as you can see. So for this stretch of time, for this stretch of time, it's A, because it's only A speaking. We can then bring that down to a very simple label of 1, meaning one person is speaking. The next one, AC, A and C are speaking. We can bring it down to a simpler numeric version, 2. And so you can build this n-gram of what's happening over a stretch of speech according to who's speaking or according to how many people are speaking. Okay, so now we needed data to work on this. So we're very lucky in that Martin, who's on the call, is from the University of Stockholm, and Kathleen, who's a co-author, is from the University of Tartu. And they have some very nice three-party Swedish and Estonian data, where people spoke for 15, 20 minutes, 3 people. Now they have a really nice lab setup. As you can see, they have this nice waist-high table with the cameras and everything in the middle and around. And you probably also notice they're wearing these belts at chest level and waist level to capture the respiration signal, to capture the breath. Now we're not looking at breath in this. And then we had a third corpus that I got from Diane Littman in Pittsburgh, which is 3-party English speakers who are discussing a sort of a collaborative game. So in total, we had 9 hours, almost 10 hours of speech, which came to about 22,000 IPUs. So we labeled all of that for floor state. We then isolated any intervals, I'll need to go back for this, any intervals where one person is speaking alone, so like that interval A, for at least 1 second. And then we searched forward through the data to find the next time where one person was speaking alone for at least 1 second. The reason we chose 1 second there was we looked at the data, and the mean length of an utterance in our data, if you discount very short utterances like and yeah, is about 1 to 1.2 seconds. That sounds like very, very quick for someone who's not into speech, but in speech, that's 4 or 5 words easily. So it's a sentence, you know? So we chose this 1 second threshold on either side in order to capture something that seems almost like a turn. So where are we? I'll go back to this slide for a second. So basically we would find any case where this part here was at least 1 second and this part here was at least 1 second. And then we'd collect the label for the middle. So the label here would be 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1 to show what's going on, okay? And now let me jump back to where I was. Right, so let's go on very quickly. So when we looked at the 1 second to 1 second single party speech, which we're saying is very similar to either a turn change or a turn retention, because the people on either side are speaking for at least 1 second. This is what it looks like. We can see that around 30 to 40% of all transitions are with one interval in the middle, which is like the dyadic case. One person speaks, there's a silence or an overlap, and then one person speaks. And then they go up in odd numbered steps. So for 3, you'd have one person speaks, maybe there's a silence, maybe there's some overlap, maybe there's some more silence, and then one person speaks. So they go up, I mean, they damp off very quickly. It's a basic damping curve on the number of intervals between the clear speech on either side. The odds are just they're just a function of the fact that it's almost impossible for one person to start speaking and another person to stop speaking at exactly the same time, which would be called a smooth switch. It just doesn't happen. Or well, it happens, but very rarely. So we threw out all of those even number cases. We found that practically all of the data were accounted for up to 15 intervals. So up to 16. So we threw out anything over 16 and we concentrated on the data we had just to look at between and within speaker transitions. So what we found was that for between speaker transitions, all 3 languages follow a fairly similar curve. There's a more linear descent on that. There's a smoother drop off. So you get one interval, obviously, in between speaker is the most common. And then there's a smooth drop down through 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. Within speaker transitions, in other words, the same speaker starts and finishes, keeps the turn. There's a big number of one interval transitions. In other words, these are probably silences. This one person is speaking, they stop for a short time and they continue. And then the rest of it drops off. Now, why is this important? Well, up to now, people have generally been concentrating on looking at just one interval. So they're not looking at the 3s, the 5s, the 7s, because nobody's seen them. So if we then take the same data and remove the constraint on the end of the transition, that it be one speaker, and say, on one side, it's 1 second of one speaker. On the other side, it's one speaker for any amount of time. It doesn't have to be 1 second. Then what we see is the vast, vast bulk come out as one interval, which gives us the wrong picture, where we generally model dialogue as having one gap or one overlap. but that's not what's happening. Almost 60% of the transitions are not happening like that. So we really do need to look at them. So that's just comparing the two on a confusion matrix, and you can see that we would, if we were to just check, is it a between speaker or a within speaker transition, which is something you really need to know, because it's either the system keeps the turn or cedes the turn or vice versa. You will be wrong on almost 30% of labels unless you count the intervals, go into the more detailed look. And that's a lot to be losing. The number of intervals changes for 60%. That's not such a big deal. So I think I'm more or less finished. Yeah, okay. So this is about half of what was in that paper, because the other half is very prosodic stuff. So the multi-part, what can we conclude? Multi-party conversation can be busy. It is not that simple. Now, the novelty of this for the prosodic literature really is that accounting for the right-hand context and putting these minimum length thresholds has a serious effect on how transitions are classified, and also shows up how these multi-interval transitions are very, very important and common. How does this matter for dialogue systems? It matters because more and more, for example, Alexa is trying to sell itself as an in-home system where the whole family can talk to it. Now, unless Alexa understands how people actually negotiate turn changes, it's never going to have this friendly chat. It'll be fine for question answering, but you need to have some knowledge of this. What we're doing with this, we've already tested this on a couple of other corpora and the same results. So the next step is to introduce more features. For example, the duration of the transition. How does that change the numbers? Look at the interplay with breath on the Swedish and Estonian, which we've done on another paper for speech prosody. The main goal for me is to catalog the most common transition types, because once you have that, you can do very large corpus studies to get the data you need to build realistic looking transitions, rather than just hoping they'll show up on whatever data you have. You can do a more sensible one. Maria in the phonetics lab, Maria O'Reilly, is going to do phonetic and acoustic analysis on the most common transition types, so we have an idea of what they are and what we're looking for. We're already in Team C. Mayank and Brendan are working, we're working on a paper where we use this analysis of the speech and silence in conjunction with some topic annotation they have to see what's happening around topic changes. So that's more or less all I have to say, but I better jump back to the first slide and introduce my co-authors. So this is all work with Katalin Are from Tartu in Estonia, who also works in Stockholm. Maria O'Reilly from the phonetics lab in Trinity, and Marcin Wodarczak, who is from Stockholm University, and I think is on the call. So if anyone has any questions, fire ahead.
He is on the call. Emer, thanks very much. I'm going to stop that recording, but that was great. And yeah, as you say, questions welcome. Folks, feel free to unmute yourselves or